Welcome to Architects of Imagination, a game dev podcast where we talk to the brilliant minds behind your favorite video games. And today I am very pleased to announce my good buddy Tomo Moriwaki. Welcome to the show, Tomo.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for
Right
having me on.
on. Today's episode is sponsored by Undertone Effects. That is a studio specializing in visual effects for video games. Thank you to Undertone Effects. And let's just start out with just talk about Tomo. You're currently serving as Chief Creative Officer for Hyperkinetic Studios, which you and others founded. Tell us what led you to that, what exactly a Chief Creative Officer is, and what fun stuff are you guys working on right now?
To start off with, I think in a video game company, Chief Creative Officer is kind of at the foundation of it, sort of just like the lead game designer in a lot of cases. But I feel like over the last, especially 10 or 15 years, it's taken on more serious kind of like high-level storytelling and sort of entertainment product management aspects. And I think they're also expecting you to, say cool stuff.
Yeah.
Now, Hyperkinetic started in 2014. Me and Rich Bissot and Dave Padilla found ourselves found an opportunity to stop whatever we were doing and start a company. And I feel like you feel it, right? This idea like we're old console game devs and we have this dream that we're going to start a company and we're going to do it our way. That was definitely a big chunk of it. Although I feel like our approach was to care more about sustainability and figuring out what a company in the future is going to actually be about. And so we tried out all kinds of stuff. And although we did make a game or have a game internally, and it's hugely complicated and painful that there's a project that doesn't have a client that's paying for it.
Yeah, that's tricky. Tell us about some of the things you landed on. That we started a company too. Undertone Effects is I'm the CEO for and creative director. You mentioned kind of wanting to do things right, wanting to do things your way more sustainably. What does that mean to you guys? How does that manifest internally for you?
I feel like there's like a conversation about morality here where I feel like, and I think that there's a ton of nuance and tons of complexity when it comes to philosophy, and I'm not going to get so far into that, but I feel like it's really easy to mistake long-term efficiency for goodness. And I think a lot of things that we see as good are really just long-term thinking instead of short-term thinking, right? If I'm going to sacrifice the future for, and what often sounds like my personal gain, people don't really like that vibe, even if that's kind of mostly what we do as human beings. But I think a lot of our thoughts were just about, our reputation really matters. The people that we get to know are people we're going to know forever, including the people we hire, the clients we end up doing work with. And so I think sustainability at its core for us was really social in nature and kind of like a network and community and relationship. And we took the skills that we had built up over the decade or decades that came before that and, kind of took that larger concept to test. And I think we've survived nine and some odd years. And, I wouldn't say we aren't still struggling. There's still tons of stuff that we have to figure out and aspirations for the company, but so far so good.
Yeah, nice. It's been a major thought for us as well. Having, we've all been, you work at big companies, you go through the grinder, there's, everyone knows about massive crunch. That's a thing. And I worked on great productions that had very little crunch and were like, easy sailing, high fives all around. Everyone's happy. And I've worked on pretty, let's just, to be diplomatic, difficult productions that were not like that. So yeah, a few things that we did too. So a lot of us starting our company too. We have talked a lot about, just treating our employees humanely and sort of just being an employee centric company, so that just happiness. The happiness of our employees is like a paramount thing for us. And we've instituted like siestas, our official policy.
Nice.
People are like, take an hour nap after lunch, which I do all the time. It's fucking awesome. And other stuff
you know,
like that.
I have a like something I like to do is take the thing that I believe in, that I think is good and right, but have the most awful description for it. And in doing so, sort of like prove the rule, right? That like I think it's good to be good just for the sake of good. You believe this is right and you pursue that and you be that person. I think that's a great way to be as a human being. That said, if we're in this big machinery of the world and everyone else is there as well and we all have to get along, and winning is easy to identify, or success and failure, like we don't want to fail or we don't want to diminish or die out, and we want to be successful. And so I think a lot of the world will get in this argument about whether being good is effective. And I think in this context, the people that we work with being happy is always going to be effective. When you get to a place where you're not good to them, you should, before that happens, you should fire them. And that's totally reasonable thing. Like, we need to accomplish certain goals, and all the way until the moment you are literally not a part of the company, I'm going to treat you as well as possible. And here's the awful way of putting it. Let's pretend I hated everyone around me. If I was smart, I would still treat them extremely well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I've come to value exactly what you said a lot more as time goes on. We've all been in circumstances where, like, yay, great team, everyone gets along, and we're getting beers afterwards. That's kind of peak game day. It's a lot of fun. There's jokes going around. Like, all right. And we've all worked on productions where, like, there's a couple of assholes. And it fucking sucks. It makes it kind of miserable. So yeah, I think yeah. But you do have to, while you're in the trenches, you have to be kind to everyone and treat them well, and get along as well as you can with the people you're with. Sometimes they're not nice to you back, which makes it a little painful.
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like the two sides of that coin for me are that it's like, it just feels really good to get along with people, especially in the work that we do, like exploring into the unknown and finding cool stuff together. It kind of doesn't get much better than that, and why can't it be then, like, emotionally really satisfying and feel good? But then the flip side of that is, you still can't argue against that. It's like, if people are unhappy, they'll be less productive, and if it's your fault that they're unhappy, that means it's your fault they're less productive.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I 100% believe that. um, let's talk about some of your latest work. You guys created Epic Tavern. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. So first of all, it's not that much latest. It's been around for a while. I think it's our big, both, like, maybe the most interesting project I've ever worked on, and at the same time, like, an albatross around our necks. We
Yeah.
we did a Kickstarter back in 2000 and I think at this point, was it 17? I think 2017, and pulled in like 70-80K or something. It was Kickstarter for a long time has really been more of a promotional vehicle than a fundraising vehicle.
Yeah.
But that got the ball rolling. It gave us some idea that there was interest in the idea, and it's a game where it's a very sort of systems heavy, text heavy, sort of storytelling toy, where you're set in the role of a person that owns a tavern in a fantasy world, and the kind of idea is that the would-be heroes of the land are coming to your tavern for drinks, and you sort of, through befriending them and serving them drinks, get them into groups and send them out on Dungeons and Dragons like adventures that are sort of partly procedurally generated and sort of partly custom generated. We wanted to create this illusion of a player authored story experience. We played a lot of these really hardcore PC games like a la Paradox Interactive and like Dwarf Fortress, and at the same time sort of seeing a lot of this emerge in idle game. I know that we have a story with idle games.
Yeah.
And these games that sort of at least explore the idea that you don't do things, or what you do is very limited or maybe unexpected. And I think we took some of those ideas and you know, used it as a vehicle to explore systematizing storytelling. Now that's a tall order, and when we started the process, we kind of didn't really understand what we were getting ourselves into. 7 years later, it's the thing that taught us the kind of the inner workings of what us humans do almost all the time, which is storytelling.
Yeah, and it's kind of like almost it's flipping D&D on its head a little bit. Well, normally you are the adventurer going into the dungeon, having that story, but to be, I mean, I would almost point an analog to like Football Manager or something like that,
Big
where
time.
like you're kind of designing like the structure that then the players do their thing in. That's pretty cool.
Sometimes we call it a reverse RPG.
Yeah. Here's a question. Speaking of sort of procedural narrative, you know, so is that to say some of it is like sort of pre-written, and then some of it kind of like takes elements together and randomizes them?
Yeah.
Um, here's one thing that makes me wonder about the big talk. We were just hanging out at GDC and had some great conversations. AI, machine learning, Chat GPT. It makes me immediately wonder about and I play a ton of D&D, by the way, and in a lot of the forums that's being talked about a lot. Who's going to be using AI to sort of write story setup stuff and do narrative design to generate concept art for their characters and world setting bits. um, you guys are, this game was made well before any of that was even in anyone's head at all. But yeah, it makes me wonder. Do you have any thoughts about that? Is that something that you would want to incorporate and could incorporate, or against incorporating? Like, tell us where you see that kind of tech in your future.
On the moral side of it, we don't have any problem with AI whatsoever. There's going to be disruptions. Their hearts will be broken, and some people will have a ton. I mean, a lot of people like us, I think, are just going to have a ton of fun because it's such an interesting and sort of new and deep tool to play with. Um, but I think that if we started the game now, it would just be a broad range of different AI tools kind of interconnected and doing what it's doing right now. We joke around that we sort of spent the last several years in Epic Tavern sort of pantomiming what AI does, trying to create an output that is sort of like an AI storyteller. Um, and like the work, the physical work, the actual words that we put into the game are kind of like the training data, and then we have the player be the, I guess, the agent of machine learning as it kind of navigates through all the data and strings it together in a story. It's very complicated. It's maybe it's too complicated. I think that we another joke I like to tell actually is, well, for every veteran systems designer you have at the beginning of a project's sort of conceptual beginning, that you increase the complexity by one whole order of magnitude. And in those early conversations, we had 5 veteran systems designers.
Man, yeah, you're right in that procedural narrative world building, however you look at it. I mean, we are almost kind of like manually trying to sort of define rules and produce the things that an AI is going to just kind of do from the other direction, right? Just look at lots of things and output something similar.
Well, the AI has this power, or just like machine learning in general, this approach is what's new about it is that it can do the fuzzy connecting that needs to be done kind of at the scale of language. And I think that that's always been something that we haven't had access to as old school game developers, right? We make the world infinitely complex and as realistically as possible, pour tens, hundreds of millions of dollars into making that happen with tens and hundreds of developers, some of whom are super, super veteran, been doing it their whole lives. And at the same time, it's like you can't talk to someone in the game and it be anything other than either totally canned or super strange.
Yeah, man. Let's switch gears a little bit. Talk about you mentioned this is probably your favorite project you've worked on. Can you just going back into your career? Is there any favorite sort of like moment or game that you worked on that like what's the thing that you were most proud of that you've done in your career?
So I don't think Epic Tavern's my most favorite project. But kind of the same way that the most important education in my life hasn't been my most favorite times.
Yeah, it's usually
um,
not.
but I mean, for me, it's very easily the Spider-Man 2 project in 2004, for
Okay,
which I
yeah,
was the creative director, and it was definitely sort of like that was the big turn in my career. That was a big turn for me as a person. It was like the first time I was on a team that was more than like 70, and there was like about 120 people on that team. It was a big deal. Lots of pressure from all the sides at Activision and inside the company. Got to work with a ton of awesome people, and we got to make a ton of awesome stuff. I mean, it was a really great project. Even if, and maybe partially my fault, there was a lot of crunch on that project. Although early 2000s, I think we were all doing a lot of that. Not
yeah,
trying to excuse it, but
yeah. It's pretty standard. And that was in Treyarch, yeah.
yeah.
Is there a moment in the game, a system that you were like you most stoked about that you would sort of put a pin in, like, yeah.
Well, I was on my way to being sort of like focused on systems design and or tech game design, kind of as my kind of main skill set in the lead up to Spider-Man 2. But the Spider-Man 2 definitely sort of sealed the deal, and I think it was really our expression of the Spider-Man swinging in the sort of like pseudo open world that we had, where it all sort of came together. These ideas of like it's hard to have complexity and action, especially because of just sort of just the animation burden alone is kind of overwhelming, and getting sort of a valid and elegant control experience amid that complexity. And this complexity I'm talking about is really just what players expect out of Spider-Man, because Spider-Man is sort of like omni mobile, walk on every possible surface or crawl, fly through the air, throw webs around, get incredible speeds going, and so that was the problem space that I think taught me the most in my life,
Yeah,
and pulling it together was great.
those are hard problems to solve. Those are not trivial.
And we even put a ton of effort sort of into the progression of the control schemes of unlocking abilities and kind of it's not as well remembered, but the combat system in Spider-Man 2 had a really deep combo system that used the buttons weren't necessarily like there was a punch and a kick button, but there was also a web and a jump button that factored directly into the combat. And so it was our first stab at really employing the kind of verb concept in game design, and that those buttons were intent, not sort of a one-to-one specific thing. And of course, it's always a one-to-one specific thing, but the web button did something with web in the flow of combos. The jump button did something that would propel you up and away in the context of the combos, and that was a lot of fun to pull together.
Awesome, awesome. Have you played some of the newer iterations of Spider-Man games? I think Insomniac's done the last couple. Is there anything in there that you were like, oh man, I wish the tech could have done that, back in the day?
I mean, those Insomniac games are incredible. I think that for myself, I would keep an eye on public opinion of Spider-Man games ever since the early 2000s for obvious reasons, and there was a lot of concern that the moving around the world and the swinging and the moving around of Spider-Man kind of wasn't up to Spider-Man 2's standard. And there's a real good reason for that, actually, in that at the beginning of Spider-Man 3, we took out a ton of sort of kludges and band-aids to polish and make the control experience as good as it could be, with the intent that we would rebuild the system up to that level and then put another bunch of band-aids and kludges on that to make it even better. But partway through Spider-Man 3, basically every single major control stakeholder left
Oh man.
before they got back to making the controls good.
Oh no. Okay.
And so from that point forward, there was a little bit of like medieval times with the Spider-Man locomotion experience until Insomniac. And
All right.
I mean, granted, maybe that's not a surprise because Insomniac's an outstanding studio and there are a ton of awesome people there.
Yeah, and the one of the with the 5 with the latest one too. Like one just technology advantage that they've got is the new like ultra fast drive reads, right? Where they can do like just massive cities, which would have been just impossible, sort of back then.
Oh yeah, if you go back and you look at Spider-Man 2 and look at how clunky our LEDs were, you can it's hilarious.
Yeah.
In fact, it was even at the time, I think that a lot of people felt hesitation about shipping it. But
Okay.
it was too late. We had a big city. We had all this content. You're moving around and you see hundreds and hundreds of meters, and you can at like, I think it was like 80 or 90 miles an hour, like cruise your way through the city.
Awesome. Let's take a turn. Let's talk about your getting your start in the industry. So if you were a creative director back in the 2003 2006 era, generally people don't start in that position. They'll work their way up. What was your first game company that you worked at? What did you do, and what was your sort of progression to working your way up to that?
So I started in '97, I think, around summertime. It was just I think I was just coming by, and it was at Treyarch. I had befriended the co-founders through a common friend, and the idea was I'd just swing by and take a look at their game, and they were working on a game called Die by the Sword at the time, which is interesting because it's a 3D sort of action fantasy combat game with a team that had 0 animators. That one of the co-founders had their PhD dissertation was on simulating human movement. Very interesting stuff. And kind of after I visited and played the game once, we just hit it off, and I kept coming by. And then, so it was right before summer actually, because then when I was at Long Beach State as a sculpture major at the time.
Oh wow!
That summer they're like, "Hey, you want to work here?" And I'm like, "Sure." And I never went back to school after that.
Awesome. So who are some of the early people? Like when my time at Activision, I sort of know Lamia as one of the heads of Treyarch. Who was it in the earliest days?
So back when it started off, Treyarch made a deal with Interplay to ship this game, Die by the Sword, and it was run by Pete Ackerman and Don Likeness.
Okay.
I think his name is Dohan Koslu. Actually, I think he changed his name. And then like Chris Bussey and Mark Now, they were this kind of like very early small team working on this game that they had kind of gotten funded through the the late '90s method of finding a publisher and getting funding. So yeah, this was like very early days for Treyarch. The Treyarch that we know today is this huge juggernaut.
Yeah.
And it's like really kind of a combination of Activision and whatever DNA Treyarch had. Because Treyarch was purchased by Activision, I think, in 2001, and there was some controversy over the stock price because 9/11 had just happened.
Oh.
And the whole world was, well, considering whatever the next 20 years is going to be like.
Yeah. A weird time for sure. You mentioned you studied sculpture before this. What's occupying your time outside of work these days? Do you have any personal projects or hobbies that you're into?
I mean, not too much. I do a lot more cooking. I mean, like many people over the pandemic, picked up cooking. Although I was kind of on my way. I think I'd found, like, in the years leading up to the pandemic, I was cooking for my kids a lot, and had sort of discovered it and was sort of selling the idea of cooking as a really great exercise for any designer, because you take mundane ingredients and you put them together in a way that you think will work for a particular audience. And if that's not a description of what we do as game developers, I don't know what it is.
It kind of is, for sure. Yeah, that's interesting. And some things work together, and some really don't.
Yeah, and you get surprised. Like, I thought I knew my daughter, and it turns out that this is something I put together with a lot of care and effort, and it's just totally balanced.
And if you make things too spicy for who you're dealing with, then that's a problem too. Talk about inspiration for you. What are some games that you played as a fan that you really loved that informed your approach to game design?
Well, so I think the first half of my career is heavily informed with sort of action and adventure and shooter experiences, a lot of skill I was definitely, and maybe embarrassingly so, a part of that old school game dev mentality that would say things like story and games don't belong together. Um, and um, and I hated that I said that back then, but I did say it. Um, but we were very fixated, like games like Ninja Gaiden. Um, um, oh, I gotta now I have to decompress the old version of myself to kind of think these
The old
thoughts.
memories, yeah.
Lots of RPGs, a lot of JRPGs. I was definitely one of those blockbuster weekend JRPG kids when I was growing up. Um, but at the same time, I didn't really think about those games for making them, because what really dominated a lot of the thought process was how to create interesting skill challenges through controls, and how do you make the experience on screen make that experience satisfying. So there's kind of two big pieces of that puzzle. One is kind of the kind of calculus of what is hard and what is easy in the context of a number of buttons and reaction times, and that's sort of like that's pretty sciency and kind of very psychology based, and that's only something that a lot of us felt. We were good at feeling it because we had played so much, but it's really hard to kind of articulate. And then the other side of it maybe is a little more straightforward, even though I guess it's still psychology and sciencey, but this idea of impact and how to convey it, right? And this is something you know very well. And you probably also have this experience in your life where there are a lot of people that just kind of don't see it. And I like calling that impact blindness, by the way. But
Yeah,
just like
that's a good term.
withholding a few frames before Mel Gibson chops off someone's leg with a two-handed sword in Braveheart. The halts and the time dilation kicks that you put into place to kind of punctuate impacts, the way you describe follow through, how you signal at the beginning, and then how you kind of describe how things play out with the results. All that stuff is a very VFX heavy and also sort of like action combat sort of skill set. And those were the things that were and we had a whole team of designers that thought the same way. And I think that was probably the luck that was really essential for Spider-Man 2's control scheme to come together, and that we had a few projects before that to know each other. But then there's the second half of my career, we'll call it the last decade of my career, which is really shifted into kind of like a much higher level kind of what is entertainment? How do you engage human beings? How do you make them feel whatever it is you want to make them feel? And then that becomes almost entirely storytelling in nature. And so I spent, last decade plus really heavily focusing on the development of Epic Tavern and all the explorations that came from that, understanding, coming to this statement that our brains only do one thing, and it is storytelling. And it's really at first only for one reason, to make sense of what's happened so far. And then that flowers into everything else in our lives, all the communication, all the entertainment, all that stuff. At least that's my current belief.
Okay. And just to riff off some of those ideas, one, it's kind of funny that your early philosophy of story doesn't belong in games is like quite literally the inverse of what your game is, right? The entire thing is creating a story. Yeah, and punctuating effects. I've thought about, in if you study like traditional, hand animation, there's the sort of principles of animation, and you mentioned a few, overlapping action and anticipation and weight and all these things. And we use these terms all the time when we're sort of critiquing each other's work. And I've wondered if, and thought about even formalizing like the game dev version of that, where there's a few other things that are important. There's your you're communicating gameplay and other things in there.
What,
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think the nice thing about doing something like that is that in the context of games, it's a little bit more. There's some complexities there that we've kind of figured out, right? Kind of like this needs to work in a wide range of circumstances, not just the one circumstance you're putting together, and that forces us to solve certain problems. And it's been an interesting time caring about that.
Yeah, you mentioned too, like sort of the viscerality of the controls, right? Here's one idea that I've had. I've never tested, but I wonder if it would be a viable game design thing. Where think of like a vertical shooter or something, right? You're a plane, and then you have enemies come out in patterns, and you continue, or say a racing game. Like there is kind of a, you know, every player is going to handle each moment slightly differently, right? But there's kind of a cadence and a rhythm that you get into with your hands, with your fingers, with your input device. In a racing game, like you're pedaling and you're turning, and like there's this sort of flow that you get into. I've wondered if it could be possible to sort of essentially define that and allow that to define the rest of the things. So, for example, if I'm doing sort of maybe a wipeout like racing game, have it generate the track like close your eyes and give yourself a controller and just kind of do like break like kind of like let yourself kind of like the designer design like a fun rhythm that your gestures are doing, and like let the track itself kind of manifest from that. Or even the bullet hell game or the vertical scroller, yeah, just like just this cadence of like the left button, the right button, and joystick, and like let the enemies that come out be defined by sort of this rhythm. And as I play music a little bit, like to me, like that, I think of it in terms of like rhythmic cadences and progressions in a song, and going from like hyper fast moments to slow, and having contrast in rates of things. I don't know. That's just been a kind of a philosophical idea I've thought about for a while now.
Well, what's funny about that is that's kind of the way I bridged between the two ideas of second by second action to the story. You know, a good action game has this sort of millisecond by millisecond story. And by that, I just mean that it has pacing and rhythms, and the meanings are spaced out in the right sort of ways, in ways that feel good to human brains, right? Another thing I like to describe as story these days is really the configuring information into a shape that is easier for humans to absorb and retain and understand. And so, obviously, if we were to read a novel about math and it's just describing it in prose the whole way through, there's going to be some difficulty understanding the math. I mean, not that the conventional way we teach math is a whole crapload better, but if we can find the way to shape information, even like an explanation of, let's say, how to drive a car, even, that you shape it the right way, it's fun. It's interesting, right? You lean in. Suddenly you care about what's going to happen next. It's just storytelling. And so, ABBA, back, ABBA, back, jump, those kind of rhythms, I think are just finding the right ways for those to be is a huge part of it. And it's the same in stories. And it's the same in a kind of like a series of explosions to kind of send off the end of an experience. I mean, all those things they have a lot of intersection, and I guess, well, a lot of their intersection exists kind of in the sort of rhythm and magnitude space.
Yeah, and it makes me think of like early arcade games too, where like say Defender, which is a kind of notoriously hard game, right? You get into this like, you get into this flow, and it has some of that storytelling arc going on at just sort of a micro level, right? Where when you die, it's like there's your rest, or like between right before a wave comes out. So there's these little arcs that are going on, just like are going on in a story, just like are going on with your fingers.
Are you going to be able to finish up what you need to do with the wave? But if you don't get that dealt with appropriately, right, it suddenly gets really tricky at the end, and the whole time you're hoping that doesn't happen in Defender.
Yeah.
And then if it does, and you overcome it, right? There's plenty of stories we know like that.
And talking about sort of story and its role in video games too. And now I think about The Last of Us, right? Like that now has moved into television as a medium that's been a big hit. So yeah, maybe another way I would, your early impulse of not story in games. I think another way to sort of say that maybe is still relevant is like that it's the sort of gameplay first is a term we've all heard and used a million times, right? Like that kind of has to be Well, depending on the type of game, right? Like some games are certainly very narrative driven. A Last of Us game is, right? There's sort of story things that are playing out. But if you, but if you're not, having fun in combat and stealthing and doing the thing and collecting, and they're kind of moving your brain between these spaces in a sort of narrative story arc, but even just a gameplay arc, right? Where you're in combat, it's tense, like, oh, you're gonna die. Ah, okay, now I'm just like collecting bandages and doing stuff, and then a kind of an emotional story beat. So that's interesting to see it sort of flow between them all. But if you don't have good gameplay, like if it isn't fun to like fuck up the zombies, like what are we doing here? That kind of has to be
Well, I think
prime.
that there are some big pieces here, right? And so if the story, the kind of overarching story, if it's the worse it is, the more the gameplay kind of has to hold everything up on its own, and its own internal pacing, kind of like let's say that you're going to do a 5 minute activity, right? And it takes 3 steps, and if that activity is not going to be very repeatable, if those steps are always exactly the same, and if you know what's going to happen, like if at the beginning of those 5 minutes you know what's going to happen at minute 5 with 100% certainty, you won't even finish it, right? Your brain's like, I'm done, I get it, I'm happy with this. And so kind of like, I mean, uncertainty is another humongous element of what we do, and that's kind of really strongly connected to the anticipation, right? You're like, this might happen, and or these are two things that might happen, and one of them is much more interesting to you than the other, but you're going to have to put some work in to get there, for example. And if you make that promise at the beginning of any stretch of time, that's definitely going to get someone to lean in. And then now, as they step their way through that experience and kind of putting in effort and paying attention to how things are changing, as long as they don't get a promise that seems like totally full of crap, and as long as they don't get a result that seems totally kind of against the expectations that were set up, you can kind of keep that ball going. But as developers, we only have so many things that we can throw at the player because we have only 100% of our resources to develop with, and so it has to sort of get broken up in these sort of clever ways, and we have to make use of kind of pacing and contrast to the best of our abilities to keep it fresh from moment to moment. And that can happen at the high level story in a way, but those moments are longer. Or it can happen, in a Street Fighter fight, which happens, in sub-second time frames. Or I think like a good example for the kind of all the minute cycle, all the kind of scales of time in between that are like your conventional RPG experiences where it's like, oh, I can do this thing minute by minute, I can do this thing hour by hour. I think Monster Hunter comes to mind, where a fight can take like half an hour against one big monster, and the techniques they use for wounding the monster and having the monster move on to run away and move to another place starts kind of creating changes to the experience that kind of keep my mind willing to pay attention, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like I remember, back in the Call of Duty days, some of the designers talking about, different like length cycles, right? There's, you want, so taking the macro one, your evening of gameplay, right? You might get 5 or so matches in. So what is the like arc that you're going to go through during that? Okay, and then within one match, okay, here's a 12-minute little episode that you're going to do. What's the progression inside of that, and all these little cookie trails of dopamine that you're like
Totally.
injecting every like kill streak that you get, and everything. And then you can just keep going down to the like there's the individual sort of engagement where like, okay, I've got 4 seconds now of like really intense fighting, and then even less than that. So yeah, it's interesting to think about things in terms of different like scopes of time, and how like all that is sort of designed.
Well, I think it's crazy how much of a world there is just inside of moving, seeing a target, going into scope, trying to lay the center of the screen on the target, and pulling the trigger, and all the things that we've done to make that cool. Like, that is insane. And that's definitely something that non-game developers couldn't possibly understand. Like, that I have hundreds of hours, maybe more than 1,000 hours of having thought about just those moments. and all the things to do to make it more interesting. And there's like, the behavior of your target. I mean, if it's multiplayer, it's other humans, but you've shaped things so that they're going to behave a certain way. If it's AI, then you've completely controlled how that thing is going to behave. And just the feeling of the ADS movement, how snappy it is, the way the bullets don't go all perfectly in the center of the screen, the way the thing moves up, animating and shaking things, the specific kind of glimmer of the tracers of the bullets, the sounds. It's awesome. I mean,
And the funny thing too is it's like one's experience of designing that is like you are looking at functionally like numbers in a spreadsheet.
totally.
Seven. Oh, I want a seven here. That's going to be the right one. Let's see if seven feels good. Like
To
you
be
just
fair, it's the does it feel good, right? And then you
yeah,
change the number and does it feel good. In fact, I would say that anybody could do a great job at that if they had tools that allowed them to, within 1 second, feel the changes they made, and that they could theoretically change everything and understand what they were changing. It's a tall order.
yeah. I put a lot of value in that too. I will say, having worked in custom engines most of my career and doing a lot of Unreal stuff now, Infinity Ward had a couple of little tools in there that were kind of unprecedented at the time, like the change and play loop was incredibly fast. It was like within a second. They had another tool that I would give a ton of credit to. It was kind of a hackery of a couple of different things, but it was functionally like a replay system where, for me, the effects artist, man, did this help me do my job. And I've never seen this in another engine. I don't think Unreal can do it. And I've thought about like trying to build this in Unreal as just like to make as a thing, but I could play through the game as just a player. So I'm going through the jungle and a helicopter is crashing and its blades spinning and like it's chopping the ground up in front of me. So I could run up and play through it and kind of run back or whatever, and then I could hit a button that would rewind time 10 seconds, and then it would just sort of play through that.
Nice.
And then I could I ran a command that put it put that command on a loop. So it would just like play through that moment over and over again. And then I could go to my effects editor and just type 12 cent. It was like this little gesture of 12, enter, Control S to save it, Control Alt S to send it. So I
It's
just got
amazing.
a little flow of like I'm watching it. Are the like bits of rocks flying past my face fast enough? A little slower? No, now they're short. Little farther. It was an amazing like process. I've never seen anything like that in any other tools. It was magnificent.
I would theorize that that's a part of why you're a genius in that way.
Well, I didn't develop the tool.
No, but like you got to like, like because we have a very similar tool with the Spider-Man control stuff where we could stop it and step through frame by frame because we could actually time dilate all the frames of the animations we had a lot of control over. We could skip what we wanted to and stuff. And once we really got heavy into that, it totally changes your brain chemistry. Like now you think in those terms. And if you've done that for like, hundreds of hours, like your brain is comfortable spotting all these things. And how like you have to really understand all the things in a category if you want to talk about it off the cuff and comfortably. And like, what do? It's all we do when we hang out.
Let's take a little turn into. I wanted to talk with you about the idle game genre for a little bit. So a kind of funny anecdote. A night out drinking with you back in the day. I think we were all about to get in the cab, and you were talking to who was it? I think it was one of the founders.
Petri Yarvalaton.
That's right, yeah, Petri. And you guys were talking about a clicker game or something, and I talking about exponential representation of numbers. What? I'd never heard of a clicker game up to that point, and so I inquired a little bit and got fascinated, and then my wife wanted to kill me after a while. I got addicted to Clicker Hero, and about maybe a year and a half later, I was 20th in the world at Clicker Hero
Dude.
without having spent a single penny. Yeah, it was. So let's talk about idle games. What is it about exponential numbers and the representation of them in there that was that fascinating seed that led me on this dark path of idle game play?
That was amazing. And when I saw you the next time, you had a beefy phone battery that you had constantly plugged into your phone.
So I could always click.
um, yeah, no, I think it happened with Cookie Clicker, and then Progress Quest. But and at the same time, I think we had some client work with someone who wanted to bring some of those Chinese Diablo games that played themselves over to the States. Nothing ever came of that though. Um, and so it was something that, I mean, I had a lot of hostility towards the idea at first. This idea that you're going to play the game by not playing the game was like sort of, I was very emotionally
Offensive.
resistant to that. Yeah. But then I just started playing Cookie Clicker because, some friends were playing it. And, when other people play games for a while, I start to care a little bit more about it. I want to understand what's making them tick. That's kind of the maybe the most important professional perspective I have that I've held on to. It's like someone understands, someone is having a good time. Let me understand why they're having a good time because that's sort of relevant in what we do from day to day. But yeah, this at, I eventually got to the point where I now see idle games as the most important type of game for a game designer to research. Because if you can take a game and pull away everything except for its progression, naked progression. In fact, it's just number goes up, right? And make that engaging. I think that really says something really deep and essential about the way our brains work and how they get satisfied. Now, it might, some of these games might seem sort of cheap and it's a cheap trick, but they put the work in for that cheap trick to work. And so let's say you're never going to make an idle game. In fact, you're going to make games just like Last of Us. It's still worth it to understand. It's still worth it to understand what it's like if you take things away and still make it interesting, and how little you need to get people to pay attention. I was really, and then I really got into the idle game genre, and basically at this point, I'll have one or two idle games running at all times on my computer, and probably one on my phone, and just kind of keep an eye on it. I don't time trial it ever, just because it requires that. Then it's not quite an idle game at that point too. That's really more like it's kind of like surfing. It's like I have to hit the buttons, and then when we hit this turning point, then I need to change to this mode. So it's a little bit, it's funny. I guess idle game in active mode is kind of like piloting a starship in Star Trek.
Yeah. Totally.
But yeah, I think this, more and more as time goes on too, you're finding these idle games connecting themselves to a narrative and finding a lot of success. East Side Games and their games like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and Trailer Park Boys. It's not like a deep narrative experience necessarily, but it's freaking hilarious, and it does help you keep going to just see the story unfold. It's like what happens next, even when it's cheap, is still sort of interesting to us. And then, God forbid you connect it to hilarious characters that you on a show that you enjoyed, but that under the hood, what drives all of those kind of like branching statements or changes to the story are just the number goes up. And yeah, it's like set in the context of these buildings are generating money and the characters in Trailer Park Boys are, pissing in buckets and all that stuff still happening. But I mean, those are also really interesting experiences to explore and understand because even if you're going to have a story like Trailer Park Boys, that you can still reflect it with numbers and you have an actual, because it's actually a very successful and money-making game, we have a real life example of it being successful for the audience.
Yeah. And another little bit about him too that I kind of find valuable for other things too. I played a ton of World of Warcraft, right? And if you look at just over time as you add more levels and more power and more armor, and then the numbers go up, like it is so easy for it not to be a linear curve. It's an exponential curve. And so like so the way World of Warcraft handles it is to do these crunches and resets where the numbers all squish down to an early stage of, but that same problem. They're just gonna
Yeah,
essentially have to continue to do it over and over. And clicker
sucks.
games handle it in a different way, right? They just get into like the exponent of a thing and present that differently, that's kind of a fascinating bit.
Well, I mean, the idle games have no problem with like enormous exponents. So like numbers that would have more zeros than would fit on your screen and stuff. But World of Warcraft does. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I just lost your video feed. No worries. So World of Warcraft, every expansion, right? They do the reset, and so it's still like a sawtooth. And most idle games do sort of like a prestige type reset as well. There's like a
Yeah.
strong analogy there, right? It's kind of like the only solution because otherwise we can't create content for 1 times 10 to the 4 and
Right.
that content also work for 1 times 10 to the 200.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's a reason why it has to be exponential, actually, because
Yeah.
linear gains aren't interesting. If in World of Warcraft you at the beginning at level 1 you did 5 points of damage and at level 60 you did 20, it just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, and when you go farther out on that curve too, like you're doing, 1,075 damage, and you level up, now you're doing 1,079. Like,
Yeah,
it's
it's not good. It doesn't feel right, and I think that's one of the essential things that the clickers sort of make absolutely clear. I mean, by the time I was fighting Arthas in I think in Ice Crown Citadel, I think we were doing 1,000,000 points, more than 1,000,000 per hit, or maybe it was the expansion after, and then they did it that day. I think that's when it was the first take 3 zeros or take 6 zeros
yeah.
off the numbers. I mean, and it's not like I don't think that was the plan. I think that they're just like, the game's still going. It's 10 years later. What do we do?
Yeah. Yeah, you patch this somehow. Let's take another turn into the future now. How do you see games changing over the next 10, 20, even 100 years? We're early in the cycle of a new console generation right now. What are some things that we can't do right now that you suspect time will solve? What are some things you're excited about in gaming in the future?
So I think sometime in the near future we'll be able to have games with social negotiation in a way that, excuse me, that just wasn't possible before, and that'll be definitely accommodated by AI tools. I feel like though, more in terms of just like where the industry was heading before and where we're going to be very, very shortly. This idea of bringing together experimentation in narrative and with interaction, that's kind of reached a pretty sophisticated point right now, and it's really cool to see all these really interesting ideas. And obviously, making games is easier than it's ever been before. That said, being a successful game maker, exactly as hard as it always has been. But that means there's just so much more DNA floating around, right? I used to spend a lot of time with like Armor Games and Congregate just to sort of like farm up ideas and just see interesting little things that people were doing. And then of course mobile became much bigger than that, and there's like itch.io where it seems like all that stuff gets aggregated or a lot of people upload stuff there. This sort of all these little fragments of ideas that are floating around and bringing them together is producing really crazy results. I think. Do you feel like, remember back when the rogue-like games got big? I feel like that was like sort of like the beginning of kind of the conceptual remix culture in game dev.
Yeah, yeah, and man, I remember playing the original Rogue on my 386 or something that was just ASCII art, and then it was fucking killer.
Totally. And then you have a game like these days, like Vampire Survivors, which I don't think anyone was expecting to be so big. And at the same time, maybe those of us that have been in the industry forever feel like, why don't we try to switch up our session lengths? Why don't we play more aggressively with the various things that we see as conventional in games and try to find interesting spots that are inside the space that we're existing in, right? We're always looking out into the darkness, and maybe that's because we're addicted to exploration, but there's a ton of interesting stuff to find out there, and I feel like playing games is better than it's ever been, and it'll just keep getting better and better.
Yeah, totally. I've got 3 achievements left on Vampire Survivor. I'm almost 100% at it. Speaking of like inspiration, one of my favorite game festivals to go to, I think it's kind of little known, but Indiecade in Culver
Mm,
City every
yeah,
October. I haven't gone for a few years because I've been out in the East Coast, but man, there's some cool stuff. They do night games there, which are all like things playing with light and projectors. Super fascinating, fun little weird indie game concepts, and like those really excite me a lot.
did you ever actually play Johann Sebastian Joust?
Oh, totally.
It's so interesting.
I got it set up so if you emailed the devs, they would give you a piece. No, yeah, I was trying to get an 8 player version because I played it at Indiecade 8 player, and holy shit, that game like took the crowd. And I got it on my PlayStation 3 or 4. And yeah, that was our party game for a while. We'd have randos over at the house, and I'd set up just a TV out in my bushes,
It's
and people
awesome.
would run around my backyard with their controllers. That is such a fun game, and I think they have like a piece build of it that is 8 players that is possible to get a hold of, but maybe not by conventional means. But
I had a
yeah,
very similar experience. I wonder if it was the same Indicate.
yeah, that was awesome. Um, yeah, super fun.
Oh, you know,
Uh,
just to briefly mention, in terms of games that were inspiring in more recent times from the storytelling standpoint, um, um, Disco Elysium and Hades come to mind in terms of
okay.
just amazing game experiences that were not expected, had a lot of interesting stuff in them.
Yeah, I'm gonna write those down. I haven't played them yet, but those are sort of on my list to check out. Before we go, let's sort of talk about uh, people who are aspiring to the heights that you have achieved. Um, the standard model. There's a lot of colleges now that teach game design, and back in the day, people get in through tests, the test departments, work their way up. Um, but it is a very small subset of people that make their way up to chief creative officer at a company. Tell us, what advice do you have for people who are maybe well into their career now, that are seniors, leads, looking to start up their own thing and kind of run the show, make their own games?
Well, I mean, as a starter, leadership has to be interesting to you. And I can make it sound more interesting. That you have to be invested in making things go well for the people you care about. I think anybody could say yes to that, right? And I think that especially in game development or people in our demographic, it's really easy to have resistance to it. We run into devs, new young devs all the time that are really uncomfortable with networking. The social relationship side of what we do is the foundation, I think, and that all of the techniques and all of the things, the sort of like stuff that gets us excited specifically about games, that rests on top of that. And that if you're denying kind of developing and building relationships with the people that do the same kinds of things as you, the people that you work with, your audience, then that's gonna be a severe impediment in moving up through the ranks into leadership positions. And not because you're unwilling to do politics, but because you're unwilling to learn the skill that makes you better at making multiple people more successful.
Yeah, I totally agree too. And not many of us get into this profession with the idea of like being management one
Not at
day.
all. I know, seriously.
This thing starts with a love of games, of playing them, of like just being motivated to want to make them. So a lot of people get promoted to leads that maybe aren't suitable for it, aren't interested in it, and it's kind of like you're thrusting. My first leadership role was at Infinity Ward. My there was a bit of a studio. I don't know. I won't I won't try to characterize what
A
happened exactly.
transition. There was a transition.
Transition, yes. My boss left, and so yeah, I was just kind of promoted to lead as de facto, and so all of a sudden, that's something that I had never thought about before, that it was time for me to care about. And, I put a lot of effort into learning. I read books about it and read blogs from other managers, what they thought was good. And it doesn't, you learn the most from your failures. Sometimes it's got to be okay to fail.
I don't
I
think you
did.
learn anything from your successes because you already knew that.
Yeah, when a game is going well, when everyone's firing on all cylinders, when deadlines are getting hit, it's real easy to be a manager. Your annual
Totally.
review, that's it. It's when, you've things are kind of falling apart and people aren't delivering, and that's, how do you bring someone back from the brink, and and how do you get rid of them when that's not going to happen? Like, those are hard lessons to learn, and yeah.
Well, I think the first practice though is friendship. I'm assuming you were kind of in a similar situation to me, where I got kind of moved into the lead design position because there was kind of no one else to do it. But I'd been working with the people I've been working with for ages by then, and so you're now serving your friends. That's why I think that's the most elegant way to learn those lessons, because then it's from like a place of caring. It's like a place of, we're together in this, and someone needs to create alignment. You don't, I guess the another mistake, or if for newcomers, it's not about your ideas being the ones that get followed. It's not about your instructions, right? It's about a much kind of larger, more, in some ways esoteric idea of all the people moving together. And that means a big part of that is them getting along.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, it's it can be hard.
Oh, they're
Hard thing.
huge challenges.
I
And
think about too contrasts in leadership styles over time, right? Where you look back to the 50s and 60s when it's like there's your boss, and better do what he says, and like I don't know, like that was sort of de facto, right? That's kind
yeah,
of just how it all operated, and like I can't picture it that way anymore, right? Like leading by example, getting in there and being doing the work yourself. I think that's one of the biggest challenges for me in leadership has been, before that, when you're a production individual and you're like, you're outputting work, right? You're, in my case, doing effects for levels, and then at one point, okay, now you have to deal with sort of schedules and who's on what and are things on time, and all this sort of stuff is coming into play, and you're going to a lot more meetings and you're responding to a lot more emails, and it's like that, like making stuff, that thing that I loved to do. It's like, balancing the two of those. I did not find a good balance in my sort of earlier days of the impulse to do stuff, and you as a lead may even have a formal workload you're expected to do, and it's like I can't do both of these. So now I am crunching, and that's not setting a good example, because I don't know. That's a tricky one. Is delegating and finding a reasonable life balance yourself as a lead.
I don't think there's a good answer. I think for both of us, thankfully, when we were doing that, we were younger. Because yeah, I just overcommitted back then a lot, and I mean I can't do it quite as well. I'm going to be 50 soon, and I can feel it. It's not it's not the same, and I know it's not just that my body's not as strong as it used to be. It's like the thought process needs more care. I need to be a little more strategic in how I burn my conceptual resources.
Yeah, and I think one little bit of philosophy for me in management that I sort of lean into these days is just trusting the people that you're putting responsible for things. Believe in them, even if like you don't agree necessarily with their outcome. It's I think it's not as important to just like force how I would do it on them, as opposed to supporting the decisions they're making and being okay with it. Like, you have to trust your team.
Yeah, I try not to use military analogies as much as I used to, but it's kind of hard for me not to. But I liken a game development team as a bunch of generals that all have their own army. And it would never make sense for one general to walk over to the troops of another general and tell them what to do. And I think
Yeah.
that packed in that example is the reason why we don't micromanage down or up or sideways. It's that person's there for a reason, and the quality of the project, you might want it to be better, but it's going to be exactly as good as the team. And as long as everyone's getting along, you're going to get close-ish to a better result. You know, I think, when you start off, you're fixated on your own details. And so once you, I don't know, grow up or have more responsibilities or become in a management position, you don't forget that, right? So you imagine, like, we can make these things better. But it's really hard to recognize the cost of making those things better. And I mean, I don't know if I have the answer, but I do know that more often than not, that getting in there and trying to force a result, it costs more than it's worth.
Yeah, I agree. Every time I hang out with you, I have just a fascinating conversation that I think about for days to come.
Nice, same.
It is always a pleasure to run into you. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Architects of Imagination.
Thank you for having me, and invite me back anytime.
All right, killer, man. I should also thank, again, our sponsor, Undertone Effects. Thank you to our co-founder and executive producer, Martika Ibarra, and the whole team, Alex. And check us out on everywhere podcasts are published, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. And thank you very much again for tuning in. We'll see you next time. This is Architects of Imagination, and I'm DJ.
Bye, guys. Thank you.